talked about herding cats. I saw one of the stories in Florida revolving a cat. So the guy lost his house in one of the tornadoes inside of the hurricane, and the only thing he did was look for this cat for a day and a half, but he did find them. So
good.
Thank goodness.
He found the cat, and it still ignored him.
Yes, that's right. It stayed away from him. That is exactly right. So thank goodness that it was down to a Category 3, and I think people did a really good job of evacuating. So even though we had Helene and then we had, of course, Milton right after that, all of these things economically do have an effect of some of the data that we're going to see. And we like to call those distortions.
Yeah.
So before we get to the cat story, let's talk about the potential distortions that we're going to see.
Yeah, whenever there are these natural disasters, and thank God that it was a Category 3 instead of the Category 5, people did, for the most part, evacuate. There are going to be lots of economic distortions in the data that we get for a few months. Oftentimes what we see is an increase in initial jobless claims as far as people is sometimes they're displaced from their work, it shuts down, maybe they can collect unemployment for a while. Hours worked oftentimes falls dramatically, so even if they stay on the payrolls, they're not necessarily going to work. So this will show up in that jobs report that we get on November 1st that the Federal Reserve will be looking at. Then also, there's all the destruction and damage, the cleanup work. And one of the things that some people kind of crassly say about economists is that they like disasters because it boosts GDP, gross domestic product, because if you destroy something, you have to build it, and that contributes to GDP.
Yeah, that's pretty crass.
It really is, because really we care about net domestic product, we care about people's welfare. And so when you adjust for the destruction part, right, you might see an increase in gross domestic product, but really what matters is that what part of that is just replacing things that were valuable and need to be replaced.
So let's talk about your herding of cats, because we've heard this saying before, and obviously you get one and the other one runs away from you.
That's right.
And that is really the analogy you're trying to use with the Federal Reserve.
That's correct. After the last Federal Open Market Committee meeting, a lot of people were saying that Powell was doing a really good job about keeping people together. There was one Federal Reserve Board governor who dissented, who said, I would have preferred a 25 basis point cut instead of 50. And we got the minutes this past week, and it actually shows that maybe there was a little bit of mutiny taking place, or people were like, I'm not so sure about this 50 basis point cut.
Which is unusual for the Federal Reserve. They usually are in lockstep because they talk about these things before the vote comes.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that I've oftentimes wondered, what does the Federal Reserve Chair do with all of his time? Right? Obviously looks at a lot of data, but he has meetings with all of the voting members to know how are they going to vote? What are they seeing? And so when he goes into the meeting, he presents a few different options to vote on. And he was really pushing hard for this 50 basis point cut. In the minutes, it really said a lot of them would have preferred 25, but they were persuaded that they could do 50. Now,
in retrospect, now after the 50 basis points, we saw some data, and it changed the betting odds of what could happen at the next meeting.
That's right. Yeah, we actually saw a slight uptick in inflation. So the CPI, Consumer Price Index, it's still about 2.4% year on year. So it's not horrible, but it's not great. But there was a slight reacceleration. And we also have the labor market showing that it's doing pretty well. It is softening, but it's still very solid. And so now when we look at the betting markets as far as what might the Fed do next, here, you think back just 2 weeks ago, it was saying, hey, they're going to do another 50. Now it's saying, do they even need to do another 25?
Right. So it could be 50, it could be 25, it could be 0.
Yeah.
It is, nobody knows. Even the Fed governors don't know right now. And that's the reason why we look at really a continuum of opportunities. What happens if any one of these three things happen? And remember, folks, this is happening after the election. We still don't know if we're going to have a winner, right? Because it could be very, very close, but we'll have to see. And so that is one of the big news items that is coming off. And, of course, we talked about hurricane relief, and some of the insurance companies we're watching as well, because how did they handle that?
Yeah, the financial services. And so part of financial services, you have banks, brokerages, and insurance companies. So that's all part of that financial services sector. And that sector has done pretty well. But there was a lot of anxiety about how the insurance companies would fare with this another natural disaster. The fact that it was a Category 3 instead of Category 5, some of the early estimates are that the total insured losses, instead of being close to $200 billion, it might be closer to $100 billion. So it's still a loss, but not
$1 billion
as
here,
bad.
$1 billion there. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so lastly, speaking of financial services, earnings season started this week, and on Friday we had some of the big banks report. weren't as great as we thought they were going to be.
That's right. It wasn't. And I think that's actually somewhat okay, mainly because the parts that were weaker were about that those interest rates as far as loans, those haven't moved all that much. So their cost of financing, the deposits, the savings accounts, the interest rate they pay on that has gone down just a little bit, but we haven't seen a huge move in loan rates ever since the Fed started cutting. So a little disappointment there. But some of these big banks, we did actually, one of the signals that I like to look at is their loan loss reserves. So they try to estimate with the loans that they're making, how many of those might start defaulting. And it wasn't as bad as I feared. One of the big ones, JP Morgan, big credit card issuer, same thing, Wells Fargo. They did see an increase in loan losses as far as provisions, expecting that consumers might come under a little bit of pressure, but they're actually saying that those delinquencies and defaults are running a little bit lower than what they were fearing. So the consumer is still in a pretty good position.
And one thing I want to end with, folks, is the fact that we talked about at the beginning of the year is where the S&P 500 could go. We started the year around 4,700. Here we are coming close to 6,000 on the S&P 500. The reason why we say you have to stay invested, just know what you own, why you own it, and how much you're paying for it.